Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are, and welcome to Unsubscribe, or otherwise known as How to Be a Successful Marketer in the Age of Data Privacy. Just while we are getting some more people joining in, we'll give it a couple of seconds and then we will be on our way. All right, let's get started. Well, once again, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to do our very best to show you how to be a successful marketer in the age of data privacy. As we get started, just to introduce ourselves today, my name is Hannah. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Zeotap, and I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague Pritika, who is one of our product managers. Everyone wants to say hi.
Hey, hi everyone.
So Pritika is going to be joining us to show us some of how this works in real life, as well as taking your questions towards the end as well. Which brings us to the agenda for today's session. So first things first, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping, as we always do, and then we will move on to the meat of today's session, talking all about unsubscribe and how to be a successful marketer. And then, of course, we will be coming on to your questions. So, of course, the housekeeping, the interesting stuff. First things first, please submit your questions throughout today's session. We will take as many as we possibly can at the end. So hopefully on your screens, you can see a little tab that says questions, and in that you can write your questions. So please go ahead and ask us anything. We will do our best to make sure that we give you good answers. You will also see on your screen a little tab that says chat. So if you're having any issues of a technical nature or any questions about, do you get the recording and all the rest of it, please feel free to drop it in there and we'll address them as quickly as we can. But please also use it to interact with each other. So it would be great if you could drop into the chat where you're dialing in from today and just give a shout out to your fellow attendees and get to know each other. I, for one, am in London, so hi to anyone else who is too. And of course, the recording is going to be sent afterwards. So if you have to drop out or if you want to share this with any of your friends and colleagues afterwards, look out in your inbox tomorrow when it will be landing with you. All right. So that's the kind of housekeeping stuff. A very quick intro to who we are as Zeotap. So our big thing is all about creating unity between data and privacy. We do that across 3 key products, which many of you will be familiar with. At the center of it all sits our CDP, our customer data platform, and adding into that is Zeotap Fuel, which is our data asset, and ID Plus, our universal ID. So we're born and bred in Germany, even though I personally am not, and rooted in data, and now we're about 200 employees worldwide. And to get a little bit more of a detailed view for those of you who like that kind of thing, this is how we kind of work. Collecting, unifying, segmenting that data so that you can activate it, orchestrating it across your multiple different channels, and expect to see a little bit more of this later on. So here we go. What we're going to talk about today, first of all, is where we are now. Why are we talking about how to be a successful marketer in the age of data privacy? Then I'm going to move on to something that I like to call the personalization paradox. I'm going to talk about what it is and what we need to do about it. Thirdly, hopefully, I'm going to suggest how we might be able to solve all of these problems that we're talking about today. And finally, I'm just going to throw in a little coda, which is a new and random idea. Some of you may agree with me. Some of you may disagree with me. And I'm looking forward to hearing your opinions on this new proposal that I throw down at the very end of this session. So let's get started with where we are now. In other words, how marketers ended up all dressed up with nowhere to go. So let's dial back a little bit. So when we're talking about the age of data privacy, what we all know is the road to GDPR violations is paved with good intentions. We are all out here trying to do a good job as marketers, and the prevailing truth today is that smart marketing is built around customers as individuals, otherwise known as personalization. We can see this as a trend that has been unraveling gradually across any channel that we work through. Whether it's email, whether it's SMS, whether it's website personalization, point of sale, this is what's happening there. And this is what we're generally all trying to do, more or less. And we can really easily see that in how our MarTech stacks have evolved over the years. So, this is kind of how a stack might have looked like maybe 10 years ago, something like that, something that we're all familiar with. A couple of key tools. Do they integrate with each other? Maybe, maybe not. But it's evolved somewhat since that time. Here's another example of a tech stack that got slightly more complicated. But what we've come to at the end of this is actually, I'm just going to throw myself into the middle of this, a tech stack that is all centered on seeing the customer as an individual. So rather than different stacks connecting to each other in different ways and passing data in 100 different directions, what we're starting to see evolve is all of these stacks connecting to one central place where we get to see the customer in all of their glory and all of their interactions, exemplified here by me. And, of course, this is what I get to see every day in HubSpot. I don't know if there are any HubSpot users out there, but shout out. But there's a problem with all of this, as we well know, and that problem is data privacy. So what does that mean for all these kind of beautiful tech stacks and single customer views that we've been building up over the last few years? Kind of means that it's all a little bit redacted. So at the end of the day, what we've got is we've got all the tools to get this right in terms of personalization. And for the vast majority of us, we kind of have all of the data to get it right as well. Some of us have it more organized than others. It's okay. It's a journey. But the problem is, because of data privacy, it's really hard to use them. So that's the all dressed up with nowhere to go that I'm talking about. But the reason why this is really critical for us is because of this thing called the personalization paradox. So what do I mean by that? The paradox is that customers still expect high levels of personalization, even though they expect their data to be well protected and well used. So a couple of stats to exemplify that. So what we've got is 92% of online customers talking about data security and privacy as a major concern of theirs. And I think, with every story that we've seen over the last few years, Cambridge Analytica, etc., it's no wonder that it's such a high number that are very acutely aware of how their data could be being used. But then at the same time, you've got 80%, nearly just as many, saying that they want a relevant and personalized experience. They're more likely to purchase when they get that personalized offer. But of course, in order to personalize, you need the data. So we end up in this paradox, kind of stuck as piggy in the middle as marketers here. So there are three pillars that emerge at the foundation of how to be successful in this age of digital privacy. The first thing that we need to do is, of course, create those high return customer experiences, that core of personalization that we've been talking about and wanting to achieve for such a long time as marketers. But resolving that while treating privacy as part of the brand. So we've got to basically take these two sides of the paradox and try and make them work together. But the third one is just as important. We need to be able to do all of this at speed and at scale. And this is something that I'll talk a little bit more later on about, because it's no good having these first two things working together if it's manual, if it's mechanical, if it doesn't allow us to be able to operate, change, iterate, optimize quickly. So those are the three things that we're really going to focus on today. And hopefully this next section is going to talk about how we try and do that. So to get started, let's dial back to the kind of three core principles of data privacy. These are the things that underlie things like GDPR or CCPA. So firstly, you've got data permission. So this is all about, can you capture that data and are you doing it in the correct way with the correct kind of consent? Then there's data access. This is also known as the right to be forgotten, more or less. Do consumers have the ability to access and control their data, have it deleted by you if they so wish? And the last thing is data focus, which is that kind of, exciting, mysterious one of the three, which we will come back to later on. And this is all about, are you capturing only the data that you need And are you using it for the purposes of which were originally intended? And this is actually quite an interesting one, and we will come back to that later. But for now, our focus is just going to be on data permission to get started with. So I'm going to go through this in 3 different steps. And these 3 different steps will emerge to be what I like to call the 3 C's of data permission. And if you get these right, you are building yourself the foundation to be able to execute personalization, to be able to do it with privacy baked in, and to be able to do it at speed and at scale. So really, developing that foundation for your success. So this step 1 is consent management. So collecting data and collecting consent in the right way. And everyone will be familiar with everything that we had to do almost 4 years ago to the day when GDPR came into life, which was change our forms so that we made sure that we were capturing consent in the right way. And now is when hopefully you guys can see a poll on your tab. And I'm asking you which one of these 2 forms is correct in terms of compliance. Is it Form A or is it Form B? Submit your answers now, please. And let's see what you say. I'm just going to give you guys a couple of seconds. Okay, we've got A in the lead. B very much falling behind. Almost unanimously A. Okay, I'm going to unveil the answer. All of you that said A, you were correct. Well done. Nobody said B. So congratulations. Your DPOs will be very proud of you. The other part of data permission, in addition to all of this, is getting a consent management platform. If you guys are familiar with the likes of Didomi or Usercentrics, some of the big players in this space, this is the other critical pillar of being able to make sure that you're getting consent in the right way. So you get those boxes ticked in terms of how you're collecting that data and getting consent in the right way. But there's another step, and this is the really exciting one. Now, this is consent mastering, otherwise known as the single consent view. So we're all familiar with the idea of a single customer view, being able to have all of the data on an individual aggregated into one place and one view. This is that same idea, but about consent. And so we'll see why this is important right now. So if we've got one individual customer, they are probably interacting with your brand across so many different touch points these days. So let's say, for example, our customer here signs up for a loyalty card in store. In doing so, she says yes to email, no to SMS. But then she creates an account online. Maybe that's handled by a different app. Maybe that's Magento. She says the same thing. So that's great so far. But then on email delivery, maybe sent via something like MailChimp, depending on what your platform is, she actually then unsubscribes to email. And then maybe later on, she's interacting with customer service, and then she says yes to email again. So with this proliferation of all of the different touch points that we have, which has obviously grown exponentially throughout the last couple of years during COVID, when we had to run up different systems very, very quickly, what we have is a bit of a hot mess of different yeses and nos when it comes to consent, and those are stored in different places. So right now, if you're deciding whether or not you need to send an email or you can send an email, it's going to be quite difficult to find the right answer unless you create a single consent view. And this is where you can use a CDP. In real time, you are collecting all of those different consent and marketing preferences and resolving them. So we know that her overall answer to SMS was no, but her most recent answer to email has been yes. So you can send an email to her. You push that data over into your email service provider, and away you go. So that's the important part. That is the kind of second element here to what we can do in terms of data permission. It's not enough just to capture that consent. You need to resolve it. Now, the third part here, consent orchestration. So this is where it comes back to this idea of speed and scale that we talked about earlier on. So let's go to your relationship with your DPO. I'm sure it's your absolute favorite one. So when you're doing things like sending promo emails or service updates or running a display campaign, you should probably get your DPO to check whether or not it's okay to do it. Same again, loyalty, discount offers, probably get your DPO to check whether it's okay to do it. Right audience, right people, right preferences, all the rest. Now, of course, I think we all know that if we have to get our DPO to check every single campaign, we are not going to be able to do anything at either speed or scale. So this is our problem. Do we take the risk or do we move slowly? And this is where consent orchestration can solve that challenge for us. And this is all about getting you and your DPO to set what we call consent rails. So these are basically systems and processes that you set up once, and then you as a marketer, you can run along them forevermore. So let's say, for example, you want to run this kind of email marketing campaign. We sit with our DPO and say, yes, you need GDPR consent to do that. And yes, you need email preference ticked in order to do that. If those two things are correct, you can go ahead and send that email. So forever and forevermore, you have that plugged into your system. So you automatically are able to make sure that you're compliant, even if you want to send 10 email campaigns a day, which is ill-advised, but still. And this is how something like this might look within the platform, which we will see very shortly. But fundamentally, these things are all adding up to the 3 C's of data permission: management, mastering, and orchestration. Can you collect the right stuff, but critically, can you make it all work in a single consent view? And then can you do all of that at speed and at scale? So with that, I would like to hand over to Pritika to show us what it looks like in real life. So over to you.
Thank you, Hannah, for that wonderful walkthrough and letting us know why those 3 C's are important. Let me just share my screen and show you how we actually do it in the platform. Okay, I hope you are able to see my screen. Great. So yeah, as a CDP, it's just not about aggregating data or creating profile or activating it, but it's about doing this in the most privacy compliant way possible. And with that as in our mind, we make sure that our consent module takes care of a couple of things. One, it takes care that we standardize the consent across sources from where the data is ingested. We unify their profile and create that single view with all the consent and marketing preference against a user profile. And lastly, we give that orchestration capability where you can set the universal rule on how the data should be activated within your ZeroTap CDP platform. So let me just take you through one by one on how this happens. So first, when you onboard on a ZeroTap CDP, the first thing that you will do is you need to set up all the different purposes of consent that you are capturing from your source. That is just a simple form where you define all the different consent that you are going to get under each regulation. This can be a custom consent that you are collecting, or it can be something like a standard consent which TCF follow, and you can define and set them for your ingestion. Once you do that, let me just cancel this. Yeah, once you do that, you can also set the marketing preference, which basically defines the channel on which your customer are okay with you reaching them. And these also can be custom as per your brand and your requirement. And you can define it as many as you want in your account. So let me take an example here of a telco use case where data might be coming from various different sources. And when I say sources, it can be something like an offline source like CRM, from where you might be capturing marketing, email, SMS consent, or from website, you might be capturing consent like your advertising, retargeting, personalization consent. And say from app, you might be capturing consent on app notification, personalization, and retargeting. This is where we have found the need to standardize this across sources. And that is where our steps to onboard a source will come handy. So as part of onboarding a source, we have a step called catalog mapping, where you define all the fields that will be ingested into ZeroTap. As part of that step, you can also define the consent field, and this is one of the key data points that you bring in for each source. So over here, you can map it to a consent field or a marketing preference field, and you can tell us which data to be stored against which purpose. So this is where one level of standardization is applied. The second level of standardization that we allow is the value standardization. We clearly understand that all these sources are implemented differently, as well as the consent that gets captured are captured in a very different way. Maybe in one source you are capturing it as yes and no, maybe from other you might be capturing it as true or false, and in some it might be captured in the form of codes. All of that can be standardized using a very simple to use enricher tool, which is a transformation tool, and you can define it right at the time of onboarding the source. And all of this that I'm showing it, it's a one-time setup that you do when you integrate a source with ZeroTab. Once this is done, all the data that we ingest will have these values and consent standardized and ingested from individual sources. Then the next layer kicks in, which is your unification or mastering layer, where we unify all these data coming from different sources and create that unified profile that you can use for activation, along with their consent and marketing preference stand against it. This is where you will need a tool like orchestration tool, where you can define the rules telling us how to use this data within the platform. As a CDP, we have an activation layer where you can set up segments or you can push a data to a channel like on the likes of ad tech platform like Google Analytics, Adobe targeting, or some other marketing platforms. So all of this, you can set it up as a single universal rule, something like, for example, say for all the segment that gets created in the ZeroTab platform, you would like to make sure that these users have a basic consent of advertising. You can add a rule like, let me just add an or rule saying I also want to make sure they have marketing consent and only then they should be made part of my segment. This one set, we will make sure that all the segment that gets created in your account will have users with these consent. If they are not, they will be excluded from the segment. We also make sure that we give you flexibility to define a separate rule for your channels because not every channel is of same type and you might have captured different consent for reaching out to a user on those channels. So here you can set a channel-wise consent of a rule where you can define, so for example here, for Adobe Target, I would like to say like all the users who have GDPR consent, personalization and marketing preference as display ad, and just simply save this rule. Once you do this, same as your segment rule, all the users who will be pushed to the Adobe Target platform, we will make sure that they have these consent before they are qualified for sending into this segment. With that, Hannah, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pritika. All right. Hopefully we can, there we go. You can see my screen again. So I'm just going to kind of dovetail this with one last thought, a little radical proposal to close up with today before we move to your questions. And I might be shooting myself in the foot when I do so. So let's go back to these kind of three principles that we had at the beginning. You know, we talked about data permission for the most part today, but I want to end by talking about data focus. And what I'm going to suggest is in the pursuit of being a successful marketer in this age of privacy, one thing that we should consider is abandoning the pursuit of the 360-degree customer view. Now, obviously, I work for a customer data platform, so in many ways I might sound like I'm hoisting myself by my own petard, but I don't think I am, because what I'm really saying is that you don't need the full view of the customer, you need the right view. So a big part of being successful and a big part of taking privacy on that journey with you is only collecting the data that you really need. That whole principle of data focus. We are very used as marketers now to being awash with data, collecting more than we can possibly even handle. So the consideration for us might be is what's important? What do we need to have and what do we not need to have? And that is moving away from this idea of 360 and absolutely everything to paring back to what is essential and cutting out what isn't. And finally, just to kind of round that off, that kind of takes me back to these three pillars that we started with at the very beginning. We know that we're creating those high return customer experiences, and we want to do so at speed and scale. But I'm just going to zero into this bit in the middle. And there's a reason why I've said, while treating privacy as part of the brand, rather than just saying while being compliant. Because privacy and putting privacy first is not just about ticking boxes. What it is about is showing the privacy and safeguarding your customers' data and how you use it is part of what your brand is. Because what we've found, and this was something that we did some research on at the very beginning of this year, we can share the details of the report, is that nowadays consumers are so acutely aware of how their data is being used that they are now thinking about that when they decide who to purchase from. So you can see here, if a company is going to guarantee that it's not going to share that customer's data, that customer is more likely to buy from them. They're also more likely to recommend them. So going back to that idea of making it part of your brand is the critical next step. It's not just about compliance, it's about making it part of who you are. And so just to recap very quickly, what does all of this mean? So first of all, number one is starting with consent collection. So making sure that you have that on lock, but not stopping there. It's moving on to this idea of building a single consent view. If you don't have that right now, you cannot be sure that you are being compliant. You cannot be sure that you're getting it right. Thirdly, in order to be able to do all of that, get these consent rails in place that we just saw from Pritika's demo. How can we build all of this together so that we can action and execute quickly without having to bother our DPO all the time? And then fourth, just that last takeaway is innovate with privacy. One of the next areas of innovation when it comes to, serving customers and customer experiences is how we incorporate privacy into that dynamic. And so with all of that, it's time for your questions. So let's see what we've got. I think we have two, which we're going to be able to find time for today. So first question, and Pritika, I'm going to look to you for an answer for this one. We've talked about CDPs and we've talked about CMPs as well, consent management platforms. The question is, do you need both?
Hi, Hannah. Sure. So the answer for that is yes, we do need both. A CMP has a different function and a CDP has a different function. What a CMP does, it gives you all the tool or the necessary tracking of your consent into a platform, as well as sending it all to all the vendors who need this consent for any kind of activation, and CDP becomes one of those vendors. But as a CDP, you can do much more than that. You are just not capturing the consent from one source, which CMP becomes one of the source, but also later on using that consent and activating it on the channels. So I would say the answer for that is yes, and you need both so that you can capture the consent from these online sources using CMPs, and CDP will give you the flexibility or the functionality of unifying it from all, that is not only online but offline sources, and giving that unified profile.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pritika. Totally agree. It actually leads on to the next question that we had through, and I'll see if I can answer this one. The question is, how long does all of this take to get set up on? And the answer is, how long is a piece of string? CDPs, I guess, by their nature, are incredibly multifaceted in terms of what they can do. And so many people use them for entirely different purposes. And the amount of time it therefore takes to get set up depends on what you want to use it for. That being said, it's often shorter than you think. If you start out with a very simple set of challenges that you want to resolve. So, maybe that's customer acquisition focused, maybe it's retention focused, maybe it's efficiency focused. If you narrow it down and prioritize that to a couple of core ones, then this is the kind of thing that can be set up in a matter of weeks rather than necessarily a huge amount of months, which, is the most effective way to get started. Thinking about a CDP is always about increments. So you start simple and then you keep adding on rather than trying to tackle the whole world in one go, which can, of course, be a little bit overwhelming. So ultimately, yes, this is possible in possibly about 2 months, depending on how complex your initial challenges are. But if you would like to find out more, obviously drop us a line. We can have a look at your sitch and we can give you more details. So unless there are any more questions, I think that might bring us to the end of today's session. So, I mean, thanks to Pritika for joining us today, taking us through the demo and showing us how all of this work in real life. And most of all, thank you to all of you guys for joining us today. We hope that you found the session informative, entertaining, educational, all the rest of it. Of course, the recording is going to be made available as well. So if there's anything that you've missed, you can recap on it there. But of course, any other questions that you think of later on, please do get in touch. We would love to chat to you. All that now being said and done, thanks again, and hopefully we will see you next time. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you.